An ex-soldier carried a homeless man to shelter, unaware the man would leave him a secret fortune. The words echoed in James Morgan's mind as he trudged through the biting December snow, each step a deliberate choice against surrendering to the cold emptiness that had become his life. 3 years since returning from Afghanistan, and still the shadows followed him like faithful companions. More reliable than sleep, more persistent than hope. The snowfall had begun as gentle whispers against his weathered jacket, but had transformed into an aggressive assault, much like the memories that plagued his nights. James pulled his collar higher, a useless shield against both winter and war. His apartment, a sparse, functional space in downtown Portland, was just 15 blocks away, but tonight each step felt like marching through quicksand. He'd spent the evening at his usual spot in O'Malley's bar, nursing a single beer for hours, watching other people laugh and live, while he remained frozen in a moment 5,000 miles away and 3 years past. The VA therapist called it emotional detachment, a clinical term that failed to capture how it felt to be a ghost among the living. "You're making progress, James," Dr. Hendricks had said that morning, her voice carrying the practiced optimism of someone who dealt in broken souls. "But healing isn't linear. You need to allow yourself to connect again." Connect. The word itself seemed to belong to another language, one he'd forgotten how to speak since the IED that took half his unit and left him with a body mostly intact, but a spirit in fragments. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed Washington Street. The city had emptied as the storm intensified, sensible people tucked away in warm homes. James had never felt comfortable in enclosed spaces anymore anyway. Too many shadows, too many corners where threats could hide. It was then, at the mouth of Pearson Alley, that James saw him, a dark shape huddled against the red brick wall, nearly invisible beneath layers of tattered blankets dusted with snow. Had it not been for a sudden, violent cough that shook the bundle, James might have walked past, might have continued his solitary journey through the storm. James hesitated. The city had its share of homeless, and he'd learned, like most urban dwellers, to navigate that particular guilt with practiced detachment. A dollar here, a nod there, but never stopping, never really seeing. Another cough erupted from the bundle, followed by a moan so raw it cut through the howling wind and pierced something in James that he thought had been silenced years ago. Before he could rationalize walking away, James found himself kneeling beside the figure. "Hey," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You shouldn't be out here tonight." Temperatures dropping below zero. The blankets shifted, revealing a face weathered like old leather, with eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. Despite the cold and circumstances, those eyes held a startling clarity. "I've seen worse," the man rasped, offering a smile that revealed missing teeth but genuine warmth. Just resting before moving on. James noted the man's thin jacket, the way his hands trembled not just from cold but from something else. Perhaps illness, perhaps age. The snow was collecting on the man's makeshift shelter, melting through to the layers beneath. "There's a shelter on 6th, James heard himself saying. "About 8 blocks from here." The man's laugh turned into another racking cough. "Might as well be 80 blocks in this weather, son. These legs aren't what they used to be." James looked down the empty street. No cabs, no buses in this storm. Just the relentless snow and the wind that carried it like shrapnel. Something stirred in him then. A memory of Ramirez, the youngest in their unit, hit in both legs and unable to move as enemy fire rained down. James had carried him 2 miles back to base, talking nonsense the whole way to keep the kid conscious, to keep them both from thinking about the blood that left a trail in the desert sand. Ramirez hadn't made it. The doctor said he'd lost too much blood before James even picked him up. "I can get you there," James said, the decision made before the thought fully formed. The old man studied him, those pale blue eyes seeming to look past James's face and into something deeper. "You don't need to trouble yourself. I've survived this long. It's no trouble." James surprised himself with the firmness in his voice. "I was a soldier. I can carry you." For a moment, neither moved. Then, with a nod that seemed to hold resignation and gratitude in equal measure, the old man said, "My name's Walter. Walter Prescott. James Morgan," he replied, removing his jacket and wrapping it around Walter, before carefully helping him to his feet. The old man was lighter than he expected, bones and sinew wrapped in skin that felt paper thin against James's hands. Walter's few possessions, a battered backpack and what appeared to be an old leather-bound book, were secured inside James's jacket. Then, with movements that recalled battlefield training, James hoisted Walter onto his back. Comfortable? James asked, adjusting his stance to distribute the weight. Been a long time since anyone carried me, Walter said, his voice close to James's ear. Not since my father, I expect. James began walking, each step careful on the slick sidewalk. Walter weighed little, but the symbolism of the burden felt significant in ways James couldn't articulate. Here was something straightforward, a human being needing help, and him being able to provide it. No moral ambiguities, no haunting consequences. Just one person carrying another through a storm. You mentioned you were a soldier, Walter said after they'd gone 2 blocks in silence. Where did you serve? Afghanistan, James answered, the single word containing volumes he rarely shared. 3 tours. Walter was quiet for a moment. My brother was in Vietnam. Came back different. Quieter, like he'd left his voice in the jungle. The observation hit closer than James expected. Some things you can't bring back, he admitted, and some things you can't leave behind. They continued through the deserted streets. The only sounds they're breathing, James's measured footsteps, and the persistent wind. Occasionally, Walter would point out a feature of the city, a building that used to be a grand theater, a corner where a famous protest had once gathered, his knowledge betraying a long history with Portland despite his current circumstances. As they approached the shelter, its windows glowing with warm light against the darkness, Walter's grip on James's shoulders tightened slightly. Thank you, he said. Most people look through men like me. As if poverty makes us invisible. James adjusted his hold. I know something about feeling invisible. The shelter staff welcomed Walter with practiced efficiency, a process that suggested this wasn't his first visit. James explained the situation, helped Walter to a chair in the intake area, and stood awkwardly as a social worker began asking standard questions. Will you wait? Walter asked suddenly, reaching for James's wrist with surprising strength. Just for a few minutes. I'd like to speak with you before you go. James should have made an excuse, should have extracted himself from this unexpected detour in his routine. Instead, he nodded and moved to a nearby bench while Walter was processed. 20 minutes later, Walter emerged from the intake office, now wearing clean, dry clothes provided by the shelter. He looked smaller somehow, but his eyes retained that unsettling clarity. They're giving me a bed for the week, he said, lowering himself onto the bench beside James. Weather emergency protocol. First time I've slept on a real mattress in 18 months. James didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded. I want to give you something. Walter continued, opening the battered backpack and removing the leather-bound book James had noticed earlier. For helping me? That's not necessary, James began, but Walter pressed the book into his hands. It's a journal, Walter explained. My journal? I'd like you to read it. James stared at the worn leather cover. I don't understand. Walter's weathered face creased into a smile. You wish you will. Start at the beginning and read a little each day. When you finish, you'll find instructions for what to do next. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I've been waiting for the right person, James Morgan. I think you might be him. Before James could protest further, a shelter worker called Walter's name, indicating a bed was ready. The old man stood with effort, placing a hand briefly on James's shoulder. Life has seasons, son. Even the darkest winter eventually yields to spring. With that cryptic statement, Walter turned and followed the worker through a set of double doors, leaving James holding the journal and wondering what strange detour his life had just taken. The walk home was colder without his jacket, but James barely noticed. The journal felt unnaturally heavy in his hands, as if it contained more than just paper and ink. By the time he reached his apartment, fatigue had settled deep in his bones, not just from the physical exertion, but from the unexpected human interaction that had demanded more of him than he'd given in years. His apartment welcomed him with its familiar emptiness, a space defined more by what it lacked than what it contained. No photographs adorned the walls, no mementos cluttered the surfaces, just the essentials. A bed, a couch, a table, a TV that rarely saw use. It was a place to exist, not to live. James placed the journal on his kitchen counter and stared at it while removing his snow-covered boots. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend this strange encounter had never happened. Reading a homeless man's ramblings seemed like an unwanted complication in a life he kept deliberately simple. Yet something about Walter's certainty, the clear purpose in those pale blue eyes, had awakened a curiosity James thought long dead. With a sigh that carried surrender more than decision, he picked up the journal and settled onto his couch. The first page contained only a name, Walter Prescott, and a date from 38 years earlier. The second page began with a single sentence that made James sit straighter. By the time anyone reads this, I will likely be gone, but the fortune I've accumulated should not disappear with me. James nearly closed the book then. Was this some elaborate scam? A homeless man's delusion? But curiosity pushed him forward, and he continued reading. The early entries detailed Walter's life as a young investment banker in the 1980s. His meteoric rise, his development of an algorithm for predicting market trends, his growing fortune. But alongside his professional success ran a darker narrative. Increasing isolation, broken relationships, an emptiness that expanded in proportion to his wealth. Then came entries from 15 years ago, describing Walter's decision to step away from his life entirely, to disappear, leaving his considerable fortune in carefully managed accounts while he lived among those society had forgotten. True wealth, one passage read, isn't measured in dollars but in connections, in the ability to see humanity in every face you encounter. I accumulated millions but lost the capacity to recognize myself in others. My experiment is both penance and education. James read until his eyes burned, until the winter night had deepened to its darkest hour. Walter's words painted a picture of a brilliant but broken man who had chosen homelessness not from necessity, but as a deliberate rejection of the hollow success that had consumed his youth. The final entry James read before exhaustion claimed him was dated just 2 weeks earlier. I've been diagnosed with late-stage cancer, 6 months at most. Before I go, I must find someone worthy of both the burden and blessing of my fortune, someone who sees value not in what I appear to be, but in who I am beneath the surface. Someone who understands emptiness and might use these resources to fill that void, not just for themselves but for others. James fell asleep with the journal open on his chest, his dreams for once not filled with explosions and blood, but with Walter's pale blue eyes and the question they seemed to ask, who are you beneath the surface, James Morgan? Morning arrived with harsh winter light and the realization that he'd missed his weekly VA appointment. James called to reschedule, his mind still tangled in Walter's story. Was it true? Could a wealthy man really choose to live on the streets for 15 years as some sort of spiritual experiment? He showered and dressed mechanically, the journal never far from his thoughts. Before leaving for his shift at the security firm that employed him, a job that required minimal interaction and played to his hypervigilance, he carefully placed the journal in his backpack. During his lunch break, sitting alone in the corner of the company break room, James returned to Walter's words. The entries from the man's first year on the streets were particularly gripping. The shock of visibility becoming invisibility, the cold indifference of passers-by, the unexpected community he found among those similarly displaced. Today marks 6 months since I walked away from my penthouse. One entry read, a businessman I once negotiated with stepped over me as I sat in the subway station. He didn't recognize me. Not because my appearance has changed so dramatically, but because he never truly saw me to begin with. We worked together for 3 years. Day after day, James returned to the shelter, hoping to speak with Walter again, to ask the questions that multiplied with each journal entry. But Walter had been transferred to a medical facility after collapsing his second night at the shelter. Pneumonia probably, the intake coordinator told James. And something else, something chronic. He wouldn't tell us much, but he left a letter for anyone who came asking about him. The sealed envelope the coordinator handed him contained a single sheet of paper with an address in the West Hills, Portland's affluent neighborhood overlooking the city, and a time, Sunday, 2 p.m. For nearly 2 weeks, James split his existence between work, reading the journal, and visiting the medical facility where Walter had been admitted. Each time he was turned away, family only. The nurses insisted, though James suspected Walter had no family to speak of. The journal revealed a man of profound contradictions, a financial genius who came to reject material wealth, a loner who developed deep empathy for society's most vulnerable, a pragmatist engaged in an idealistic experiment. As James neared the end of the entries, he found himself wrestling with emotions long dormant, admiration, curiosity, and something akin to connection. The final pages contained detailed instructions regarding investment accounts, property holdings, and financial instruments that meant little to James, but suggested a fortune of considerable magnitude. There were also instructions for how to access this wealth, contingent upon conditions that reflected Walter's transformed values. The inheritor of my estate must commit to using at least 60% of the annual returns for initiatives that recognize the humanity in those society has rendered invisible. The remaining 40% is theirs to use as they see fit. This arrangement is not legally binding. I'm trusting the character of whoever holds this journal. Money can't purchase integrity, but integrity can direct money toward healing. James finished reading on Saturday night. His apartment quiet except for the occasional passing car and the subtle hum of the heating system fighting against winter's persistence. The journal's final entry was dated just 3 days before James had found Walter in the alley. The doctors say weeks, not months. The pain is manageable for now. I still haven't found the right person, but I've learned to trust timing that isn't my own. Perhaps they'll find me instead. Sunday dawned clear and cold. James dressed with unusual care. Not formally, but with attention, he rarely gave his appearance. At precisely 1:30 p.m., he left his apartment and headed toward the address in the West Hills. The house, or more accurately, mansion, sat behind an unassuming gate on a secluded lot overlooking the city. James hesitated before pressing the intercom button, suddenly aware of how improbable his situation was. A voice responded immediately, asking his name. "James Morgan," he answered. "I'm here about Walter Prescott." The gate swung open without further comment. James walked up the curved driveway, taking in the understated elegance of the property. The main house was impressive without being ostentatious. Stonework and large windows offering glimpses of warm interiors. The front door opened as he approached, revealing a woman in her 60s with silver hair and Walter's unmistakable pale blue eyes. "I'm Eleanor Prescott," she said, extending her hand. "Walter's sister. Please come in, Mr. Morgan. We've been expecting you." James followed her into a spacious living room where 3 other people waited, an older man introduced as Walter's attorney, a middle-aged woman who served as his financial advisor, and a younger man who was apparently Walter's nephew. "Walter passed away yesterday morning," Eleanor said simply, gesturing for James to sit. "But he spoke of you quite extensively in his final days." James felt an unexpected stab of loss. "I only met him once. Once was enough, according to my brother." Eleanor's smile held grief but also warmth. "He said you carried him to shelter during the worst storm of the season, that you treated him like a human being when most saw only his circumstances." The attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Morgan, are you in possession of Walter's journal?" James nodded, removing it from his backpack. "And have you read it in its entirety?" "Yes." "Then you're aware of Walter's unconventional wishes regarding his estate?" James shifted uncomfortably. "I read something about inheritance conditions, but I assumed that was meant for family or—" "It was meant for you," Eleanor interrupted gently. Walter was quite clear. He spent 15 years looking for someone who embodied the values he came to embrace. He believed he found that person in you. The financial advisor spoke next, her tone matter-of-fact. "Walter Prescott's estate is valued at approximately $68 million, Mr. Morgan. The majority is in diversified investments, with some real estate holdings, including this property." James felt the room tilt slightly. There must be some mistake. "I only carried him 8 blocks. Anyone would have done the same." "But anyone didn't," Walter's nephew said, speaking for the first time. "You did. And Uncle Walter was an excellent judge of character. Always had been, even before his experiment." For 2 hours they explained the details of Walter's will, the structure of his estate, and the responsibility he had entrusted to James. There were no legal constraints on how the money could be used. Walter had been adamant about that, but his wishes were clearly documented in the journal that now belonged to James. "You don't have to decide immediately," the attorney assured him. "Take time to process this. The estate can remain in trust until you're ready." When James finally left the mansion, the winter sun was setting over Portland, painting the city in hues of gold and rose. He stood at the property's edge, looking down at the place he'd called home for 3 years without ever feeling he belonged. $68 million. The number seemed abstract, disconnected from reality. What did a former soldier with empty rooms and emptier nights need with such a fortune? But as he descended back into the city, Walter's words echoed in his mind. True wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in connections, in the ability to see humanity in every face you encounter. Perhaps this wasn't about money at all. Perhaps Walter had recognized in James something James himself had forgotten. The capacity to see another's suffering and respond not with practiced detachment, but with hands extended, with strength offered. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and decisions James never imagined making. He kept his security job, much to the bewilderment of Walter's financial team, explaining simply that radical change wasn't his strength. Stability first, then careful steps forward. The first major decision came in February, when James found himself back at the shelter where he'd taken Walter that snowy December night. The facility was overcrowded, underfunded, and facing closure due to building code violations they couldn't afford to address. $2 million later, renovations were underway, with plans for expansion that would double the shelter's capacity and add dedicated medical services for homeless individuals with chronic conditions. "Why this place, Dr. Pinamaranton?" Hendricks asked during their weekly session, noting the positive changes in James's demeanor since he'd begun his philanthropic efforts. James considered the question carefully. "Because carrying Walter here was the first time since Afghanistan that I felt useful, not just existing, but participating. He gave me that before I knew who he was." Spring arrived with gentle persistence, melting not just the snow, but something of the ice that had encased James's heart. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting veterans and homeless initiatives, partnering with experts while maintaining a hands-on approach that frequently found him serving meals or distributing supplies alongside the professionals he employed. Word of the mysterious benefactor spread through Portland's social service community, though James avoided publicity and insisted on anonymity whenever possible. It wasn't about recognition. It was about reconnection, about finding his way back to the person he'd been before war fractured his sense of purpose. On a warm evening in May, James found himself back at Pearson Alley, the spot where he'd first encountered Walter. The brick wall remained unchanged, but James saw it differently now. Not just as the backdrop to a chance meeting, but as the beginning of his gradual awakening. "Thought I might find you here," a voice said, startling him from his contemplation. James turned to find Eleanor Prescott standing a few feet away, elegant as always, but with an approachability that reminded him of her brother. "I come here sometimes," James admitted. "To remember." Eleanor nodded, moving to stand beside him. "Walter would approve of what you're doing with his resources. The Veterans Housing Project, the medical outreach program, it's exactly what he hoped for." "I'm still learning," James said, "about wealth, about responsibility, about connection." Walter spent 15 years learning those same lessons. Eleanor replied, "He'd be the first to tell you it's a journey, not a destination." They stood in companionable silence, watching as the city transitioned from day to evening, lights flickering on in buildings and street lamps casting pools of gold on the sidewalks. "He left you something else," Eleanor said finally, reaching into her purse and withdrawing a small box. "He asked me to wait until I thought you were ready." James accepted the box with careful hands. Inside, nestled against dark velvet, lay a simple silver compass, its face aged but still functional. "It belonged to our father," Eleanor explained. "Walter carried it throughout his 15 years on the streets. Said it reminded him that even when we lose our way, the means to find direction again is often right in our pocket." James ran his thumb over the smooth surface, feeling the weight of its symbolism. "Thank you. There's an inscription on the back," Eleanor said softly. James turned the compass over to read the words engraved in elegant script. "The true journey is not finding your way home, but finding in others the home you thought was lost." Something broke open in James then, a dam he'd constructed years ago in a desert half a world away. Tears came without warning or resistance, not the tears of trauma he'd fought for so long, but tears of recognition, of finding himself reflected in the compassion of a man who could have remained comfortably detached, but chose instead to see and be seen. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, offering support without intrusion. "Walter believed you carried him that night for the same reason he chose to walk away from comfort. Because somewhere beneath the armor, you remembered what it means to recognize yourself in another's vulnerability." 6 months after that snowy December night, James Morgan stood at the podium of the newly renovated and expanded shelter, now named the Prescott Center for Community Resilience. Before him sat a diverse audience: shelter residents, social workers, veterans, community leaders, and Eleanor Prescott, who had become both friend and mentor. "This center," James began, his voice steady despite his discomfort with public speaking, "is not named after me, though some have suggested it should be. It's named for a man who taught me that our circumstances don't define us, our choices do." Walter Prescott chose to step away from privilege to understand deprivation. In doing so, he discovered something essential about humanity that many of us forget. James paused, his hand instinctively touching the compass he now carried in his pocket. We're trained to value people based on what they possess, what they've achieved, what they appear to be. But true connection happens only when we see beyond those surface markers to the shared humanity beneath. When we recognize that the homeless man on the street corner, the soldier returning from war, the banker in the penthouse, all carry within them the same fundamental needs for dignity, purpose, and belonging. As he continued speaking, James caught glimpses of faces in the audience, some bearing the weathered look of hard lives, others the polished appearance of privilege. But in each, he now recognized something he'd been blind to for too long, the reflection of his own complicated humanity. I carried Walter Prescott to shelter one snowy night, unaware that he would leave me a fortune, James concluded. But the true inheritance wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my ability to see myself in others and to be seen in return. That's a fortune beyond measure, one I hope this center helps others discover for themselves. Later, as James walked home through streets that no longer felt alien but increasingly familiar, he considered how dramatically his life had transformed in half a year. He still had nightmares sometimes, still felt the weight of what he'd experienced in Afghanistan, still navigated days when connection seemed more threat than promise. But alongside those struggles now ran a parallel reality, one where purpose had taken root again, where the isolation that had defined his return from war was gradually yielding to meaningful engagement. Not with crowds or noise or forced sociability, but with individual lives intersecting with his own, with needs he could meet and strength he could offer. The compass in his pocket was a constant reminder of Walter's legacy, not the millions that now funded James's growing philanthropic work, but the more valuable gift of redirection, of finding his way back to his own humanity by recognizing it in others. James stopped at the corner of Washington Street, looking toward the spot where his journey had begun, with an old man huddled against the cold. The city stretched before him, no longer just a backdrop to his solitary existence, but a community of which he was becoming a part. With the compass warm in his hand, James continued forward, carrying not just the memory of the man who had changed his life, but the growing certainty that even the deepest winter eventually yields to spring.